Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, according to St. Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Christ.
That same day, some Sadducees came to Jesus, saying there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, so also the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her. Jesus answered them, You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in resurrection they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astounded at his teaching. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? He said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question, What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he? They said to him, The son of David. He said to them, How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Christ.
Please be seated. This is when I get to tell you my very bad Sadducee Pharisee memory device. But I won't do it just yet. We're in the time of the church year, ordinary time as it sort of moves into fall, that we start again to get optional readings from the Hebrew Scriptures. And this is the optional reading, not the primary reading. Primary reading was the story allegedly or traditionally attributed to Moses that described the death of Moses and what happened after it, even though, well, Moses would have already been dead. I could have gone into that at some length, but it didn't seem to me so much to speak to contemporary situations in the world. It seemed to me that this passage from Leviticus, and it's one of the rare times you'll hear me say that anything out of Leviticus, particularly 18 through 20, speaks to contemporary situations in the world, but it does. Because it is quite honestly perhaps that first glimpse into the social gospel. As early as Leviticus, in the Torah, in the 3rd book of the Hebrew Scriptures. And it's important because what it says there is true, but it's important also because it brings up this whole notion of orthopraxis, which means right practice, as opposed to orthodoxy, which means right belief. And the truth is that there's always been a balance between orthodoxy on the one hand and orthopraxis on the one hand. Fundamentalist Christians are big on orthodoxy and not so big on orthopraxis. It's just not a concern of theirs. Folks from mainline traditions have tended to fall somewhere in the middle, maybe towards the orthopraxis side. Certainly in the Catholic experience, both Roman Orthodox and Anglo, orthopraxis and the social gospel has been a large part of the spirituality that's been there. And given that, we live in a country loaded with people occupying parts of their cities, this is a time when orthopraxis comes to the fore. And it's been interesting for me to watch the various reactions from, well, the media hardly count, but certainly in the media and people who are interviewed, that it seems to me that the people who are more conservative spiritually and therefore more preoccupied with right belief have much less of an understanding why somebody would be protesting in the street, whereas the people who are from those traditions that more understand orthopraxy have less of a problem with it. Except for one fool I found on Facebook who advertised on there that he is the secretary to the Archbishop of, I don't remember exactly where, either somewhere in Alabama or somewhere in Louisiana, and has started a group called We Are the 99.000 whatever percent. And his point is, he calculated the number of people in the United States at the time he started this group and figured out that what 1% of them would be. And he thinks he can get more than 1% of America to join his little group that says they don't agree with what's going on in the Occupy Wall Street and Occupy Everywhere Else movements. And I don't think he stopped to realize that he's going to need more than 3 million people to join his little Facebook group in order to prove his point. So it's something of a fool's errand. I said to Aaron, the only group I've ever seen with more than that is like the Bon Jovi fan club, and I don't think he has that kind of draw. But at the same time, what he's saying is so contrary to the teachings of the church that he works for, that it struck me that there is a great confusion in terms of the dividing line, or even, I would suggest, whether there should be a dividing line between our spirituality and our political action. And I would suggest that while the fundamentalists tend to be proponents of making their political action conform to their spiritual view, and so let's establish a theocracy, or if Jerry Falwell were still alive, let's elect him president, because then the world would be a right place. But there's this other view that says, I'm going to not force my politics into this box that's the edges of which are defined by my spirituality, but rather I'm going to let my spirituality inform my political action and allow both to be living, viable things that intersect with each other and cross with each other. And so it's rather in that light that I looked at Paul's letter to the Thessalonians. And again, there seems to be this disconnect between what Paul was saying about his experience in planting churches and contemporary experience. Paul would never have been able, and it wasn't because of the flaws we usually attribute to him, of which there are plenty, but Paul would never have been able to build a megachurch because we speak not to please mortals, but to please God who tests our hearts. And as God is our witness, we never came with words of flattery or a pretext for greed, nor did we seek praise from mortals, whether from you or from others, though we might have made demands. There is a contemporary problem with humility in this country and in the West in general, and I think it's a misunderstanding of what humility is. There's that sort of false humility, which is really supreme arrogance, that if you've ever seen a copy of the Episcopal Church's 1928 Book of Common Prayer, carrying on about beating the breast and I am a worm and no man, you see that false humility. You know, that kind of false humility that lies in someone who says, oh, I'm the biggest sinner of all. You know, as if I'm claiming that I am somehow especially privileged by being so notorious and still being loved. Or that false humility that says, I can't do the things I know I can do. I can't brush my teeth. I can't walk and chew. Well, wait a minute, not that one. I can't comb my hair. I can't find where I'm going. And we know that that's true. And then there's this sincere humility that Paul is really describing in kind of a convoluted way that says, you know, we just were who we were, wherever we were. And we weren't manipulative. We just did what we had to do and said what we had to say. And it strikes me that that's particularly appropriate to the current Occupy movements as well, in that they've very sagely set up a rotating system of leadership so that on the one hand, power is shared, and on a more practical, more cynical side that we have to be aware of, on the other hand, it's very difficult to eliminate the leaders and watch the movement fall apart. There is a certain courage of conviction that I think Paul talks about with the Occupy Wall Street people are living out and bearing out in their nonviolence, in their tendency towards very soft-spokenness, I don't know if that's a word or not, but being very soft-spoken in addressing the issues and moving away from the rage and the vitriol we've seen. Again, it's belief that informs practice and practice that informs belief. And so we come to Jesus and the Sadducees, who's contrasted with the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed in a resurrection or an afterlife. The Sadducees didn't, and that's why they were sad, you see. And so now, as that was seared into my consciousness some 16 years ago now, and I can't get it out, it's embedded in yours. Share the love. I'm always reminded of 7 brides for 7 brothers, only it's 1 bride for 7 brothers here. And that legalistic viewpoint that says what was originally intended to protect a widow and to ensure that a man would have a firstborn heir, that's why the dying child is as important. The original intent of the law was to protect the widow who, as a widow, would be consigned, if she didn't have a son to support her, to prostitution to make her living, now turns into this absurd test. It is orthodoxy carried so far that it becomes absurd. And Jesus refuses to get snagged in it. And comes down to this very simple framing of the Great Commandment. Love God and love your neighbor. And he says that on this hang all the law and the prophets, which is, in his time, a way of saying, in this hangs the entirety of the scriptures. And isn't it curious that today we see people having this tendency to want to go back and create or resurrect the Old Testament law in a Christian context? We had a brother with us last week during the General Assembly who very much sees value in restoring the notion of being a Messianic Jew and wants to do mikvahs and other rituals out of the Old Testament law, which is fine if that's what you want to do, but it sort of misses this point that how we're called to live, what our orthodoxy and praxis both are, revolve around loving God with all our heart and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And there's a part of us that thinks that's way too simple. Way too simple. And aren't there these other questions? And I think our human resistance to that is that we don't want to be pulled into relationship. I had the opportunity last evening to perform a same-sex marriage. It's not legal in Wisconsin, but I've never been one too concerned with legalities. And the guests were across a spectrum of coming to acceptance with that. The 86-year-old grandmother of one of the people who got married was the first to RSVP. And I thought that said a lot about the culture in which she was raised, probably setting her up to have the most difficulty with it, but her love overcoming those indoctrinated sort of rules. And I talked to other people during the reception who were in various places of moving from this being a pretty new idea to them to it being pretty old hat and they were fine with it. And the commonality they all shared, the thing that I heard over and over, which was so powerful to me, is that I may be along the way coming to understand the implications of this fully, but it is my love for their relative, the person they were there to support, that made me see the truth. How could I be opposed to love? And I thought that was the ultimate expression of both orthodoxy and orthopraxis. The ultimate thing that tears down our prejudices, our biases, our reluctance, our fears. If we just move from the head in the orthodoxy to the heart which motivates our practice, we are freed from whatever it is that binds us. And perhaps even more importantly, free to release others from the things it is